The dust hung in the air like a golden veil, each particle catching the dying light of the sun. It was a treasure that smelled of hay and rust, a fortune hidden not in a chest, but in the hollowed-out heart of a forgotten giant. For a moment, all she could do was stare, her breath caught in her throat, as the weight of $9.7 million in gold settled upon her shoulders, a burden and a miracle all at once. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The final, shuddering gasp of the engine was a sound Sarah had been dreading for the last 100 miles. It was a death rattle, a metallic sigh that surrendered to the oppressive humidity of the late summer evening. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed from under the hood of the ancient station wagon, a ghostly plume against the bruised purple and orange sky. She stood on the dusty shoulder of a road overlooking a wide river valley, the car's ticking corpse behind her a monument to their failed journey. They had been living out of it for 3 weeks, a rolling prison of stale crackers and whispered fears. Now even that was gone. Her hands, stained with grease from a dozen futile attempts to coax the engine back to life, fell limply to her sides. She had $33 left in the world, a crumpled 20 and a handful of worn bills tucked into the pocket of her jeans. Her son, Leo, sat on the parched grass nearby, his small 8-year-old frame looking even smaller against the vast, indifferent landscape. His wide, observant eyes, so like his father's, were fixed on her face, searching for an answer she didn't have. He clutched a teddy bear, its fur worn smooth in patches, its button eyes staring out with a kind of vacant stoicism. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" he asked, his voice a small, fragile thing in the quiet air. Sarah forced a smile, a painful stretching of muscles unused to the expression. "We always are, sweetie," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "We just need a little bit of luck." Their light brown Labrador, Buddy, whined softly, nudging his wet nose into her hand. He was a loyal and energetic companion, a furry, four-legged anchor in the storm of their lives. But now even his usual boundless optimism seemed to have evaporated. He was restless, pacing a tight circle around them, his tail low. The setting sun, a fiery orb sinking below the distant hills, cast their 3 long shadows across the road, stretching them into distorted figures of despair. Their hopes were dimming with the light, leaving them on the edge of a vast and terrifying darkness. It was then, as her gaze swept across the valley one last time, that she saw it. Set back from the road, almost swallowed by overgrown fields of goldenrod and thistle, was a barn. It was a dilapidated, skeletal structure, its roof lines sagging in the middle like a broken spine. From this distance, it looked like a leaning giant, weary from a long battle with time and weather. An idea, born of pure, unadulterated desperation, sparked in the back of her mind. It was a foolish, reckless idea, but it was the only one she had. She found the farmer on the porch of a weathered farmhouse a quarter-mile down the road. He was an old, grizzled man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, a piece of straw dancing on his lower lip as he rocked slowly in a worn wooden chair. He watched her approach with narrowed, suspicious eyes, his posture radiating a deep-seated weariness with the world and its troubles. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt the weight of his gaze, the silent judgment of her worn-out clothes, her dirt-streaked face, her palpable poverty. "Excuse me," she began, her voice hoarse. "I saw the old barn down by the river. Is it yours?" The farmer grunted, chewing on the straw. "Aye, what's left of it. I was wondering." She took a deep breath, the words tumbling out in a rush before she could lose her nerve. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to sell it." He stopped rocking. A dry, rasping chuckle escaped his lips, a sound like stones rattling in a tin can. He looked her up and down again, a flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just cynical amusement, in his eyes. "Sell it? Honey, I'd pay someone to haul that pile of rot away. It's a hazard, liable to collapse in the next strong wind." "Please," Sarah insisted, her voice trembling but firm. She pulled the crumpled bills from her pocket, smoothing them out on her palm. It was a pathetic offering. "This is all I have. $33. For the barn. Just the barn." The farmer stared at the money, then back at her face, etched with a desperation so profound it was almost a physical force. He saw her son, Leo, hovering shyly behind her, and the hopeful, panting dog at her side. He shrugged, a slow, deliberate movement of his bony shoulders. "That old thing? It's more trouble than it's worth. But if you want to throw your money away, be my guest." He reached out a calloused hand and took the bills without another word. Sarah felt a dizzying wave of relief wash over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. "It's not throwing it away," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "It's a chance." Up close, the barn was even more of a leaning giant, a behemoth of gray, splintered wood that seemed to defy gravity. The whole structure listed precariously toward the river, as if in a perpetual state of surrender. The air was thick with the smell of old hay, rust, and the damp, loamy scent of the earth. The great sliding doors, taller than two men, hung askew on their tracks, one of them jammed half open. Sarah put her shoulder to it and pushed. With a groan of protest, the ancient wood scraped against the dirt floor, opening just enough for them to slip inside. Leo hesitated at the threshold, his small hand gripping his mother's. "It's scary," he whispered, his eyes wide as he peered into the cavernous darkness. He was right. It was a monster's house, a place of shadows and secrets. But for Sarah, it was the first roof over their heads in weeks. It was a broken, tangible hope. Buddy, however, felt none of their apprehension. His tail, which had been drooping all afternoon, was now a blur of ecstatic motion. He barked, a sharp, joyous sound that echoed in the vast space, and then he was gone, a flash of light brown fur disappearing into the gloom. "Buddy, wait," Sarah called, but he was already exploring. She took Leo's hand and led him inside. As their eyes adjusted, the interior revealed itself. It was vast and shadowy, a cathedral of decay. Shafts of fading sunlight cut through the broken slats in the walls, illuminating dancing motes of dust. Old, rusted farm equipment lay scattered about like the bones of forgotten beasts. A plow here, a thresher there, all draped in thick cobwebs. The scale of it was overwhelming. It was a ruin, yes, but it was their ruin. A rickety wooden ladder, its rungs worn smooth with age, was nailed to one of the massive support posts, leading up to a dark square opening in the ceiling, the attic. And it was from that dark square that Buddy's barks suddenly began to echo. They were different now, not the happy barks of exploration, but sharp, insistent, almost frantic. Sarah and Leo exchanged a worried glance. A knot of anxiety tightened in Sarah's stomach. "What's wrong with Buddy?" Leo asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know, honey," Sarah said, her own heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Let's go see." The adrenaline of a mother's fear coursed through her, overriding any hesitation. She moved toward the ladder, her steps sure and quick. The wood groaned under her weight as she began to climb, her hands gripping the splintered rungs. She could hear Buddy more clearly now, a continuous, high-pitched yapping, punctuated by the sound of scratching. Leo followed close behind, his small hands gripping the rungs so tightly his knuckles were white. The ladder swayed with their combined weight, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought it would give way. But it held. The barks were a mystery, a siren call pulling them upward, toward a potential danger, or something else entirely. She pulled herself up into the attic, her eyes blinking against the thick, swirling dust. It was a cramped, oppressive space, the air heavy with the smell of dry rot and generations of mice. The roof sloped steeply, forcing her to crouch. Cobwebs, thick as cotton candy, brushed against her face. The last rays of the setting sun streamed through a wide crack in the roof, a single brilliant beam of light that cut through the darkness and illuminated the scene before her. Buddy was there, scratching frantically at a large, thick wooden beam that ran the length of the attic floor. He was whining, a low, guttural sound, his claws making a desperate, scraping noise against the ancient wood. "Buddy, stop," Sarah commanded, her voice sharp with alarm. She scrambled over to him and pulled him away. He resisted, trying to get back to the beam, his eyes wild. She held him tight, stroking his head to calm him, and examined the spot he had been so fixated on. The beam was massive, at least 2 feet thick, dark with age and grime. She ran her hand over the surface, feeling the rough, splintered wood. Then, on a hunch, she knocked on it. The sound was a dull thud. She knocked again, a few feet down. Thud, and again. But this time, the sound was different. It was a hollow, resonant boom that vibrated through the wood and up her arm. A surge of adrenaline, cold and electric, shot through her. Her breath caught in her throat. With Buddy whining and nudging at her arm, she looked around the dusty floor, her eyes searching for a tool. Anything. She found a long, rusted piece of metal, perhaps a part of some old machine. It was heavy in her hand. Using it as a lever, she wedged the tip into a thin crack near the hollow-sounding section and pushed. The old wood resisted, groaning in protest. She put all her weight into it, her muscles straining. There was a loud crack, the sound of splintering wood, and a section of the beam, about 3 feet long, broke loose, sending up a cloud of dust that momentarily blinded her. As the dust began to settle, her eyes fell upon the cavity inside the beam, and she saw it, the glint of something metallic. The attic was now almost completely dark, save for that one persistent shaft of golden light from the setting sun. It fell directly on the hollowed-out heart of the beam, illuminating what lay inside. Canvas sacks, several of them packed tightly together. They were stained and grimy with age, but they were intact. Her hands trembled as she reached in and pulled one out. It was heavy, impossibly heavy for its size. The rough fabric felt coarse against her fingertips. With fumbling fingers, she untied the drawstring at the top. She tilted the sack, and what spilled out onto the dusty floorboards was not grain, not soil, not anything she could have ever imagined. Gold coins. They tumbled out in a silent, shimmering river, catching the last of the sun's light and throwing it back in a dazzling, blinding display. They seemed to glow with their own inner fire, turning the suffocating dust of the attic into a shower of golden glitter. Her mind went blank. All she could do was stare, her mouth agape. She reached for another sack, her movements slow, dreamlike. She tore it open. More coins. She grabbed a third, and this one was different. It was heavier, more solid. She ripped the canvas away and saw them, stacked neatly, glowing with a soft, buttery light. Gold bars. The sheer, overwhelming reality of it crashed down on her. $9.7 million in gold. The number, a figure she had only ever heard in movies, echoed in the silent, ringing space of her mind. A wave of shock, so profound it felt like a physical blow, washed over her, followed by a surge of disbelief that made her head spin. Then came the emotion, a floodgate breaking, a torrent of everything she had suppressed for months, for years. A laugh, wild and hysterical, bubbled up from her chest, quickly turning into a sob. Tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She was crying and laughing at the same time, a raw, unhinged sound of a soul breaking free. Leo, who had been watching from the top of the ladder, his eyes wide with a child's pure wonder, finally climbed the rest of the way into the attic. He stared at the glittering pile, at his mother's strange, joyful tears, and then at the dog. Buddy sat proudly beside the river of gold, his chest high, his tail giving a slow, deliberate thump-thump-thump against the floorboards, as if he understood the full magnitude of what he had done. In the dying light, in the heart of the ruin they had bought for $33, a new world had just been born. The night descended, but the darkness in the barn was different now. It was a soft, velvety blackness, pushed back by the gentle, flickering glow of a single lantern Sarah had found in a dusty corner. She had managed to get it working with a bit of fuel siphoned from the dead car, a small victory that felt monumental. The lantern sat on an overturned crate, its light casting long, dancing shadows that played against the weathered wood of the walls. But the shadows were not the main feature of the room. In the center of the vast floor, piled in a heap that seemed to defy all logic and reason, was the gold. It was a glittering mountain in the darkness, a dragon's hoard transplanted into the heart of their humble ruin. The lantern light caught the edges of the coins and the smooth faces of the bars, making them wink and shimmer with a life of their own. Sarah and Leo were huddled together under a thin blanket she had salvaged from the car, the only one they owned. Sleep was an impossible dream. Their eyes were fixed on the impossible fortune before them, a sight so overwhelming it seemed to have burned itself onto the backs of their eyelids. Every so often, Sarah would reach out a trembling hand and run her fingers through the pile of coins. The cool, heavy metal felt alien and yet profoundly real. The soft clinking sound they made as they shifted under her touch was the new soundtrack of their lives. It was the sound of the world tilting on its axis. Leo, nestled against her side, his small body warm and solid, finally broke the reverent silence. "Are we rich now, Mom?" he whispered, his voice filled with an awe that mirrored the feeling in her own chest. Sarah looked down at him, at his wide, innocent eyes reflecting the golden light. A smile, genuine and unrestrained this time, spread across her face. "Yes, sweetie," she breathed, the words feeling both sacred and absurd. "We are." He was quiet for a moment, processing this new reality. His world had, until this evening, been defined by what they lacked. Now it was being redefined by an impossible abundance. "Can I have a new teddy bear?" he asked, his voice small and hopeful. "One that isn't all worn out?" Tears pricked at the corners of Sarah's eyes, tears of a different kind than the ones she had shed earlier. These were tears of profound, aching relief. She pulled him closer, kissing the top of his head, inhaling the familiar scent of his hair. "You can have all the teddy bears in the world," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "A whole mountain of them, just like this one." He giggled, a sound she hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. But as she held him, her gaze drifted back to the pile of gold. The initial wild euphoria was beginning to recede, like a tide going out, leaving behind something heavier, more complex. The gold was a promise of a new life, of safety, of teddy bears and warm meals. But it was also a secret, a $9.7 million secret, piled in the middle of a broken-down barn. It was a weight, a responsibility so immense it made her shoulders ache. The glittering mountain was their salvation, but she had a chilling premonition that it could just as easily become their tomb. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls, painting the interior in stripes of pale gray. Sarah hadn't slept. She had watched the lantern burn down to a flicker, her mind racing in a frantic, looping marathon of what-ifs and how-to-us. The gold, which had seemed so magical in the night, now looked like a problem, a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. They couldn't just leave it sitting there. They couldn't take it with them. They couldn't tell a soul. As soon as Leo was awake, his sleepy eyes still full of the wonder of the night before, Sarah set to work. The physical labor was a blessing, a way to channel the frantic energy buzzing under her skin. Her first task was to make the treasure disappear. She started with the hollow beam in the attic, the giant's ribcage that had served as its vault for decades. With painstaking effort, she repacked most of the gold bars and a significant portion of the coins back into the canvas sacks and lifted them, one by one, back into the cavity. The sheer weight of them was immense, each sack a dead weight that strained her back and arms. She found the splintered piece of the beam and, using a few old nails she'd scrounged, carefully fitted it back into place. It wasn't perfect, but to a casual observer, it would look like nothing more than old, damaged wood. But that wasn't enough. Her paranoia, a newly awakened beast, demanded more. She couldn't put all her golden eggs in one basket. She spent the rest of the morning prying up loose floorboards in the corners of the barn, her hands growing raw and splintered. The smell of damp earth filled the air as she dug into the ground beneath, the soil cool and loamy against her skin. She buried several more sacks there, wrapping them in scraps of oilcloth she found in a rusted cabinet to protect them from the moisture. Each hiding place was a new secret, a new layer of complexity in the web she was weaving around them. The clinking of the coins as she moved them was a constant, nerve-wracking symphony. Each soft chime a potential betrayal. Sweat beaded on her brow and trickled down her temples, mingling with the dirt smudged on her face. Finally, she took a small, unassuming canvas bag and filled it with a handful of gold coins. This she would keep with her at all times. It was her emergency fund, her escape plan, a tangible link to their fortune that she could touch and hold. She tucked it deep inside her worn jacket, the weight of it a constant, heavy reminder against her ribs. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the glittering mountain was gone. The barn floor was empty again, save for the dust and the scattered remnants of its former life. But the secret remained. It was no longer a visible pile, but a presence that soaked into the very foundations of the building. It was in the hollow beam under the floorboards in the pocket of her jacket. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind that rattled the loose slats, made her jump. The silence of the countryside was no longer peaceful. It was menacing, filled with the imagined sounds of approaching footsteps. The secret was a constant, gnawing presence in the back of her mind, a silent scream in an empty room. 2 days later, Sarah decided they couldn't hide in the barn forever. The paranoia was a poison, and the only antidote was a dose of normalcy, however small. She took a single gold coin from her hidden stash, its weight feeling illicit and heavy in her palm, and tucked it into her shoe. With Leo's hand in hers and Buddy trotting happily ahead, they walked the 3 miles to the nearest town. It was a small, sleepy place, with a single main street lined with brick buildings and faded awnings. To Sarah, it felt like a different planet. Their first stop was a small, family-owned clothing store. The bell above the door chimed, announcing their dusty, disheveled arrival. The woman behind the counter gave them a polite but weary look, the kind Sarah was all too familiar with. But that look began to change when Sarah started picking out clothes for Leo. A new pair of sturdy jeans, a bright red t-shirt with a rocket ship on it, clean white socks, and new sneakers. She didn't even look at the price tags. Then, in a corner of the store, they found it. A brand new teddy bear, soft and plush with button eyes that shone with a cheerful, vacant optimism. Leo hugged it to his chest, his face buried in its soft fur, and Sarah's heart ached with a fierce, protective love. Next was the diner. The smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee wrapped around them like a warm hug as they slid into a red vinyl booth. They ordered pancakes, stacks of them, with rivers of maple syrup and mountains of whipped cream. They had orange juice and hot chocolate. Leo ate with a focused intensity, his cheeks bulging, a smear of chocolate on his chin. Buddy lay contentedly at their feet, occasionally receiving a small, greasy piece of bacon that Leo would sneak him under the table. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah felt herself relax. She watched her son, saw the pure, unadulterated joy on his face, and felt a wave of profound relief. This was what the gold was for. Not just for survival, but for this. For moments of simple, uncomplicated happiness. "This is the best day ever," Leo announced, his voice muffled by a mouthful of pancake. Sarah smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. But as she looked at him, a shadow passed through them, a flicker of sadness for all the days that hadn't been the best, for all the meals they had missed, for the childhood he had been robbed of. "There will be many more days like this," she said, her voice soft but firm, a promise to him and to herself. "I promise." When it came time to pay, she discreetly passed the gold coin to the cashier, a young man who looked at it with wide, confused eyes. "I don't have anything smaller," she said, her heart pounding. "Is this okay?" The young man called over the owner, a gruff-looking man with a stained apron. He took the coin, bit it, and his eyebrows shot up. He disappeared into the back room for a moment and returned with a wad of cash. far more than the meal had cost. He didn't ask any questions, but his eyes were filled with a new kind of curiosity as he watched them leave. As they walked back down the main street, Leo clutching his new bear, Sarah felt the weight of that gaze on her back. The taste of normalcy had been sweet, but it had come at a price. It had made them visible. The encounter in town had unsettled her, and for the next few days, Sarah and Leo stayed close to the barn. The brief illusion of normalcy had shattered, replaced by a heightened sense of vigilance. The world outside their dilapidated sanctuary now seemed filled with prying eyes. Her fears were given a face a few days later, in the form of a man named Mr. Henderson. He drove up in a dusty pickup truck, a plume of exhaust announcing his arrival long before he pulled to a stop near the barn. He was a tall, lanky man with a weathered face and pale, watery eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He introduced himself as their nearest neighbor, his farm being just over the next rise. He leaned against the side of his truck, hooking his thumbs into his belt loops, his gaze sweeping over the barn, over Sarah, and over Leo, who stood half-hidden behind his mother's legs. Buddy, sensing Sarah's unease, stood stiffly beside them, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Howdy," Mr. Henderson said, his voice a slow, country drawl. "Just thought I'd stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood. Don't get many new folks out this way." "Thank you," Sarah said, forcing a polite smile. "We're just getting settled." "Funny," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the broken-down car and their meager possessions. "No one's been interested in this old place for years. Not since Old Man Hemlock passed. What are you planning to do with it? Bit of a fixer-upper, ain't she?" The questions were casual, neighborly on the surface, but Sarah felt the sharp probe of his curiosity behind them. He was testing her, trying to piece together her story. Her mind raced, searching for a plausible lie. "Just a little project," she said, her voice deliberately vague. "A place to get back on our feet. We like the quiet." Mr. Henderson grunted, not entirely convinced. His gaze lingered on the barn's structure, on the newly disturbed earth near the foundation where she had been digging. He noticed the fresh sneakers on Leo's feet, a stark contrast to their otherwise worn appearance. "Quiet it is," he said slowly. "Sometimes too quiet. A person can get to thinking out here, wondering about things." He pushed himself off the truck. "Well, if you need anything, a cup of sugar or a hand with that car, you just give a holler." He climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving Sarah with her heart hammering against her ribs. The encounter had been brief, but it had confirmed her deepest fears. They were an anomaly, a mystery dropped into the middle of a quiet, predictable community. People would talk. People would wonder. Mr. Henderson was the first external threat, the first crack in the fragile wall she was trying to build around their secret. Her paranoia, which had been a simmering pot, now began to boil over. She realized with a sickening certainty that keeping the gold a secret was going to be much, much harder than finding it had been. The world was full of Mr. Hendersons, full of curious eyes and questions she couldn't answer. The psychological toll of the secret began to manifest in the one place she had no defense, her dreams. That night, sleep offered no respite. Instead, it dragged her into a vivid, terrifying nightmare. She was back in the attic, but the hollow beam was wide open, empty. The gold was gone. A frantic, primal scream built in her chest, but no sound came out. She scrambled down the ladder and saw them, shadowy figures melting into the darkness of the barn, their arms laden with the canvas sacks. She tried to run after them, but her feet were stuck, rooted to the earthen floor. Then the scene shifted. She and Leo were back on the side of the road, the broken-down car smoking behind them, but this time it was winter. The air was frigid, and a biting wind whipped around them. Leo was shivering, his lips blue, his new teddy bear clutched in his arms, its plush fur matted with snow. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a silent, heartbreaking accusation. "You promised, Mom," his voice echoed in her head. "You promised." Sarah woke up with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat. The thin blanket was tangled around her legs, and her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The barn was pitch black, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. For a terrifying moment, the nightmare felt real. The feeling of loss, of failure, was so absolute, so suffocating, that she couldn't breathe. She threw off the blanket and scrambled to her feet, her movements frantic. She had to know. She had to see it. Ignoring the chill in the air, she fumbled for the lantern and a match, her hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to get it lit. The soft glow pushed back the darkness, revealing the familiar, comforting shapes of the barn's interior. Her first stop was the loose floorboard in the far corner. She pried it up with her bare hands, splinters digging into her fingertips, and plunged her hand into the cool earth. Her fingers brushed against the rough canvas of a sack. Relief, so potent it made her dizzy, washed over her. She didn't stop there. Like a madwoman, she went from one hiding place to another, checking on each one, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She climbed the rickety ladder to the attic, her bare feet slipping on the worn rungs, and ran her hands over the repaired section of the beam, assuring herself it was still sealed. Only when she had accounted for every last coin and bar did she finally allow herself to collapse onto the floor, the lantern light flickering beside her. The gold was still there. They were still safe. But as she sat there, shivering in the pre-dawn chill, she understood a new, terrible truth. The gold was not just a source of security. It was a source of immense, soul-crushing anxiety. It was a treasure that had bought her a whole new world of fear. It was a constant, silent companion, a ghost that haunted her waking and sleeping hours, whispering of all she now had to lose. The nightmare of the empty beam and the shivering, accusatory ghost of her son became a recurring torment. Sarah knew she could not continue this way, living as a prisoner in her own fortress, starting at shadows and checking her buried treasures like a mad king. The paranoia was a corrosive acid, eating away at the joy and relief the gold was supposed to represent. She needed to reclaim control not just of the fortune, but of her own mind. The only way to do that, she reasoned, was to face the ghost head-on. She had to know where the gold came from. Understanding its history, she felt, was the only way to truly own her future, to transform the terrifying, anonymous weight of it into something she could manage, something with a story and a soul. A new sense of purpose, sharp and clear, cut through the fog of her anxiety. She packed a small bag with a few of the less conspicuous gold coins, wrapped them in a cloth at the bottom, and told Leo they were going on an adventure. The town library, a stately brick building with tall, arched windows, became her new sanctuary. The contrast with the barn was stark and soothing. Here, the air didn't smell of decay and damp earth, but of old paper, binding glue, and floor polish. The silence wasn't the menacing, listening silence of the countryside, but a low, scholarly hum, the gentle rustle of turning pages and the quiet footsteps of people lost in other worlds. While Leo sat at a small table in the children's section, happily engrossed in a picture book about dinosaurs, Buddy waiting patiently in their newly repaired car parked outside, Sarah approached the main desk. She had rehearsed her story. She was a history student, she explained to the kindly, silver-haired librarian, researching the history of land use and property sales in the county, focusing on the area along the river. The lie felt surprisingly comfortable, a shield of academic purpose that made her feel less like an imposter. The librarian, whose name tag read Mildred, was delighted. It wasn't often she got to assist with what she called real research. She showed Sarah the archives, a small, climate-controlled room in the basement filled with bound volumes of old newspapers, property deeds on brittle, yellowed paper, and a microfiche machine that looked like a relic from another era. For days, Sarah lost herself in the past. She learned the names of the families who had owned the land for the last 2 centuries. She traced the lines on old, hand-drawn maps, her finger following the familiar curve of the river. The work was methodical, painstaking, and deeply calming. It gave her a sense of connection to the place, a feeling of legitimacy. She was no longer just a squatter in a ruined barn. She was a historian, uncovering its secrets one dusty page at a time. The sense of determination was a balm to her frayed nerves. She felt that by untangling the gold's origin, she was somehow taming it, stripping it of its malevolent power and bringing it into the light of understanding. This was her way of controlling her destiny, not by hiding from the past, but by excavating it. The breakthrough came on the fourth day, deep in the flickering greenish glow of the microfiche reader. She was scrolling through the local newspaper from the 1930s, a decade she'd chosen on a hunch, a gut feeling that the gold was old, from a time of desperation not unlike her own. An article from the autumn of 1934 caught her eye. The headline was bold, dramatic: Daring daylight robbery at Merchants Trust, notorious outlaw ghost, Jake Finnegan suspected. Her breath caught. She leaned closer to the screen, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. The article described a brazen robbery. A man, identified by witnesses as the infamous bank robber Jake Finnegan, had walked into the Merchants Trust Bank in a city 50 miles away and, using 2 pistols and a terrifying calm, had emptied the vault. The amount stolen was staggering for the time, nearly $100,000, mostly in gold coins and small bars, the bank's emergency reserve. Finnegan had vanished without a trace, but one of the tellers had managed to fire a shot as he fled, and it was believed he had been wounded. Sarah's hands were trembling as she scrolled forward through the subsequent days and weeks. The story unfolded like a grim novel. A massive manhunt was launched. Finnegan, known as Ghost Jake for his ability to disappear, had lived up to his name. There were no sightings, no leads. The police were baffled. Then, 2 weeks after the robbery, a small article appeared, buried on an inner page. A farmer, hunting in the woods many miles from the city, had discovered a body. The description matched Finnegan's. He had a gunshot wound in his side, and the coroner determined he had likely died from infection and blood loss several days earlier. He had almost no money on him. The stolen gold, the article concluded, was never found. It had vanished with the ghost. Sarah sat back in her chair, the low hum of the machine filling the sudden, ringing silence in her ears. She looked at the map she had pinned to the wall, the one showing the location of the barn. The woods where Finnegan's body was found were less than 10 miles from it. He had been wounded, running, looking for a place to lie low, a place to hide his loot until he could come back for it. A forgotten, dilapidated barn on a quiet stretch of river would have been the perfect spot. The numbers didn't quite add up. $100,000 in 1934 was a fortune, but it wasn't $9.7 million. But then she considered nearly a century of appreciation, the soaring value of gold. It was possible. It was more than possible, it was certain. A wave of nausea washed over her. The gold wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a lucky find. It was stolen money. Her entire new world, the foundation of her hopes for Leo's future, was built upon a violent crime, upon the loss and ruin of others. The image of the glittering pile in the barn shifted in her mind. It was no longer a river of light, but a river of tainted, dirty money. The moral ambiguity of her situation crashed down on her with a physical weight, leaving her feeling cold and sick in the quiet, climate-controlled air of the archive room. The knowledge was a poison. It seeped into every corner of her newfound security, turning it to ash. The joy she'd felt watching Leo eat his pancakes, the relief of buying him a new pair of shoes, all of it now felt fraudulent, paid for with the proceeds of a crime. The ghost of the past she had sought to understand now had a name, Ghost Jake Finnegan, and his spectral presence was far more terrifying than her vague, formless anxieties had been. She couldn't simply keep the money, not now. The weight of the secret had been heavy, but the weight of the truth was unbearable. It demanded an action, a reckoning. Driven by a gnawing guilt that felt like a physical hunger, Sarah returned to the library archives. Her research now had a new, desperate focus. She needed to know who had been wronged, who had paid the price for Jake Finnegan's crime. The newspaper articles mentioned the bank, the Merchants Trust, and its owner, a man named Alistair Finch. The robbery, the papers reported, had devastated the small, independent bank. In the midst of the Great Depression, The loss of its entire reserve was a fatal blow. Within a year, the Merchants' Trust had collapsed and Alastair Finch, a man once described as a pillar of his community, was financially and socially ruined. The trail grew colder after that, but Sarah persisted, her search becoming an obsession. She spent hours online, cross-referencing census records, birth certificates, and obituaries. The name Finch became a mantra. Finally, after days of dead ends, she found it. A single, tenuous link. A great-granddaughter. A woman named Anna Finch, living in a small town called Northwood, just 30 miles away. The drive to Northwood was a journey into the heart of her own moral conflict. With every mile that passed, the leaden weight in her stomach grew heavier. What was she going to do? Walk up to a complete stranger and tell her she'd found her great-grandfather's stolen fortune in a barn? The idea was insane, but the alternative, to do nothing, felt like a betrayal of her own conscience. She found the address on a quiet, unassuming street. The house was small, a simple clapboard structure with paint peeling from the trim and a porch that sagged slightly to one side. It was a house that spoke of struggle, of making do, of dreams deferred. Sarah parked her car down the street and just watched, her hands gripping the steering wheel. After an hour, a woman emerged from the house to check the mail. She was in her late 20s, Sarah guessed, with tired eyes and a worried line etched between her brows. She moved with a weariness that Sarah recognized instantly. It was the weariness of a person carrying a heavy burden. Later, drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, Sarah got out of the car and walked down the sidewalk, past the little house. The front window was open to catch the afternoon breeze, and from inside, she heard a voice, strained and quiet. It was the woman, Anna, on the phone. "I don't know how we're going to manage," the voice drifted out, laced with a quiet desperation. "The hospital bills are piling up. Mom's last treatment. They're saying it's not enough." The words struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She stopped, frozen on the sidewalk, the blood draining from her face. The hospital bills. The fear. The crushing weight of a loved one's illness. It was her own past, her own struggles, reflected back at her with horrifying clarity. Before Leo's father had left, they had faced the same mountain of medical debt, the same terrifying choices. In that moment, Anna Finch ceased to be an abstract descendant of a long-dead banker. She became real. She became a mirror. And the moral dilemma that had been a theoretical problem became a visceral, gut-wrenching reality. The gold in her barn, her family's salvation, was the very thing that could save this other family, this other woman who was living the life Sarah had so narrowly escaped. Sarah retreated to the barn, her mind a maelstrom of guilt and fear. She felt trapped between two impossible choices, protecting her son's future or righting a historical wrong that had suddenly become deeply personal. She tried to push the image of Anna's worried face from her mind, but it was burned there, a constant, silent accusation. A few days passed in a haze of indecision. Then, one afternoon, a small, unfamiliar car rumbled down the dirt track and pulled to a stop in front of the barn. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. It was Anna. She must have been asking around town, heard the whispers about the strange woman and her son who had taken up residence in the old, abandoned Hemlock Place. Anna got out of the car and approached slowly, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Buddy, sensing Sarah's sudden tension, moved to her side, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "Hello," Anna called out, her voice hesitant. "I'm sorry to bother you. I heard someone was living here." Sarah stepped out of the shadows of the barn entrance, forcing her face into a neutral mask. "Can I help you?" Anna's eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in everything, Sarah's guarded posture, Leo peeking out from behind her, the subtle but definite signs of habitation around the dilapidated structure. "My name is Anna Finch," she said, her gaze unwavering. "My great-grandfather used to own this land, a long time ago. This barn was part of his property." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "There are stories in my family about something that was lost here, a long time ago. The blood ran cold in Sarah's veins. She felt as if she were standing on a trapdoor, the latch about to give way. "I don't know anything about that," she said, the lie tasting like sawdust in her mouth. "It's just an old barn. We're just passing through." The denial was weak, unconvincing even to her own ears. Anna's gaze flickered, a spark of suspicion igniting in their depths. She knew Sarah was lying. She didn't press the issue, offering a tight, polite smile instead. "Well, I'm sorry to have disturbed you," she said, her tone belying the intensity of her stare. She walked back to her car, but not before giving the barn one last, long, searching look. As she drove away, Sarah knew with a sickening certainty that this was not over. The threat was no longer a ghost from the 1930s. It had a name, it had a face, and it had just found her. A week of agonizing silence followed. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car engine, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Sarah's system. She was a nervous wreck, her carefully constructed sense of purpose shattered, replaced by a raw, primal fear. She felt hunted. The barn, once a symbol of hope and refuge, now felt like a cage, its wooden slats the bars of her own making. She thought about packing up, taking Leo and a sack of gold and just running, disappearing into the night. But where would they go? The world was full of Anna Finches, full of the past she could never outrun. Then, she returned. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent, casting long, ominous shadows across the field. Anna's car came faster this time, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a storm cloud. She didn't hesitate. She got out of the car and strode toward the barn, her face pale and set, her eyes burning with the cold fire of conviction. There was no pretense of neighborly curiosity this time. She had clearly spent the week doing her own research, connecting the dots between the old family legend, the rumors of the newcomer in the barn, and the historical accounts of the merchant's trust robbery. She stopped at the threshold of the great open doors, a stark silhouette against the brilliant, dying light. "I know you have it," she said, her voice low and trembling, not with fear, but with a righteous, absolute certainty. Sarah, who had been attempting to fix a broken hinge, stood frozen, the hammer falling from her numb fingers and clattering onto the dirt floor. Leo, who was playing with Buddy nearby, sensed the sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere and ran to his mother's side, grabbing her hand. "That gold belongs to my family," Anna continued, taking a step into the barn, her eyes sweeping the shadowy interior as if she could see the treasure hidden beneath the floorboards and in the attic beam. "It was stolen from them, from us. It destroyed my great-grandfather. It has cast a shadow over my family for generations." Her voice cracked, the cold conviction momentarily giving way to a raw, painful vulnerability. "My mother is sick. That money, it could save her life." Sarah stood speechless, her mind a complete blank. There were no more lies to tell, no more evasions to offer. The truth was here, standing before her, demanding its due. Anna took another step closer, her face hardening again, her resolve solidifying into a sharp, dangerous point. "Give it to me," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but each word was like a shard of ice. "Give it back, or I swear to God, I will go to the police and I will tell them everything. I'll tell them about the woman living in the barn who suddenly has money for new clothes and car repairs. I'll tell them about my family's story. They'll come, and they'll tear this place apart until they find it." The words hung in the heavy, dust-filled air, an ultimatum that sucked all the oxygen from the cavernous space. Sarah looked at Anna's determined face, then down at Leo, who was clutching her leg, his own face a mask of fear. She was trapped. The ghost of the past was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, and it was about to bring her entire world crashing down around her. The ultimatum was a physical thing, a wall of solid ice that had slammed down between the two women, freezing the moment in time. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, the hammer's echo still hanging in the air, a final metallic punctuation mark on her old life. She looked at Anna's face, no longer just a reflection of her own past struggles, but a portrait of righteous fury. A woman pushed to the edge who was now pushing back with all the force of generational injustice. Then she looked down at Leo, his small hand gripping her jeans. His face pale with a fear he didn't understand but felt with every fiber of his being. He was the reason she had kept the gold, the reason she had lied, the reason she had hidden. And now he was the reason she was about to lose it all. The barn, her fortress, had become a trap, and the ghost of Jake Finnegan was no longer a distant historical footnote. He was here, in the room, embodied in the fierce determination of the woman whose family he had destroyed. Anna held her gaze for a long, breathless moment, then turned without another word and strode out of the barn, her rigid back a clear message. The choice was Sarah's, but the consequences were already in motion. The sound of her car starting was a roar that ripped through the quiet afternoon, fading into a silence that was heavier and more oppressive than any sound. That night, after Leo had cried himself to sleep, exhausted by a tension he couldn't name, Sarah did not sleep. She sat in the darkness, the single lantern casting a familiar, lonely glow. The ultimatum echoed in her mind, a relentless loop of threats and consequences. Go to the police. Tear this place apart. For hours, she was paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of her predicament. But as the moon climbed high in the sky, a different feeling began to surface, pushing through the icy crust of her fear. It was a feeling of profound, suffocating weariness. She was tired of hiding, tired of lying, tired of the constant, gnawing anxiety that had become her shadow. The gold, which had promised freedom, had delivered only a more gilded cage. With a resolve that came from the deepest well of her exhaustion, she stood up. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She fetched a shovel. Starting with the loose floorboard in the corner, she began to dig. The scrape of the metal against the earth was the only sound, a rhythmic, mournful percussion in the vast silence. One by one, she unearthed the canvas sacks, their weight familiar and yet alien in her hands. She climbed the ladder to the attic, her muscles aching, and pried open the hollow beam, retrieving the bars and coins she had hidden there. She brought it all to the center of the barn floor, piling it in the lantern light. The glittering mountain was reborn, a silent, shimmering testament to her impossible secret. It glowed with a cold, indifferent beauty, the light of a distant, dead star. She sat before it, cross-legged on the dirt floor, and simply looked. She looked at the mountain of gold, and then she looked over at her son, sleeping peacefully in his nest of blankets, his new teddy bear clutched to his chest. In that moment, a profound and devastating clarity washed over her. She had been trying to choose between two futures, one with the gold and one without. But that was the wrong choice. The real choice was between two kinds of wealth. One was cold, heavy, and silent, a dead weight of history and fear that she had to bury in the ground. The other was warm, breathing, and alive. It was the soft sound of her son's sleeping breath, the loyal weight of Buddy's head on her lap, the simple, unbuyable peace of a quiet mind. The gold had become a prison, its bars forged from her own fear and secrecy. She saw with a sudden, piercing certainty that the only way to be free, the only way to truly give her son the future he deserved, was to let it go. The next morning, Sarah found Anna's number in the local phone book she'd taken from the library. Her hand trembled as she dialed, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a strange, exhilarating sense of release. Anna answered on the second ring, her voice clipped and wary. "It's Sarah," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "From the barn. Can you come back? There's something you need to see." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence filled with suspicion. "Is this a trick?" Anna finally asked. "No," Sarah said, and the word was the truest thing she had said in months. "It's not a trick. Please, just come." An hour later, Anna's car appeared at the end of the track. She got out and approached the barn with the cautious, guarded posture of a soldier entering enemy territory. Sarah was waiting for her at the entrance. She didn't say a word, simply stepped aside and gestured for Anna to enter. The gold was still there, piled in the center of the floor. The morning light, streaming through the high, broken slats in the walls, set it ablaze. It was a sight so audacious, so impossible, that it defied belief. Anna stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth falling open. A soft, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. She stared, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, awe, and dawning comprehension. All the anger, all the righteous fury, seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a profound, stunned silence. "I found it the first day we were here," Sarah said softly, her voice steady now. "My dog, Buddy, he found it, in a hollow beam in the attic." She told her the whole story then, from the broken-down car and the $33, to the frantic scratching in the attic and the river of gold spilling onto the floor. She told her about the research in the library, about ghost Jake Finnegan, and about finding Anna's name. When she was finished, she looked directly at Anna, whose eyes were now filled with tears, her gaze fixed on the impossible fortune. "You were right," Sarah said. "It's your family's money. It's a curse. It's been a curse for your family for almost a century, and for the last few weeks, it's been a curse for mine." She took a deep breath, the air feeling clean and light in her lungs for the first time. "This is more money than anyone should have," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity she had found in the night. "It's a blessing and a curse. Let's make it a blessing for both of us." She walked over to the pile and, using a dusty grain scoop, she began to divide the mountain in two. Coin by coin, bar by bar, she created two smaller, but still immense, piles of gold. She didn't count, she just estimated, creating two heaps of roughly equal size. When she was done, she stood back, her hands on her hips, and looked at Anna. "Half," Sarah said. "You take half. For your mother, for your family, for the past. And I'll keep half. For my son, for our future. We'll find a way to do it legally, to make it clean. But the debt is paid." Anna stared, first at the two piles of gold, then at Sarah. The tears that had been welling in her eyes finally spilled over, streaming down her pale cheeks. She shook her head, a gesture of pure, unadulterated disbelief. Then, a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob escaped her lips. The two women, from different pasts, bound by the same desperate struggles and the same impossible treasure, stood on the common ground of a shared miracle. The ghost of Jake Finnegan was finally, blessedly, gone. The months that followed were a blur of quiet, purposeful activity. With Anna's help, they found a discreet lawyer in a city far away, a man who specialized in unique and complicated estate issues. He helped them navigate the labyrinthine process of legitimizing their fortune, creating a plausible and legally sound narrative that involved a long-lost inheritance and a forgotten safety deposit box. It cost them a significant portion, but what remained was still a staggering, life-altering sum. With her share, Sarah's first act was to establish an ironclad trust fund for Leo, ensuring his education and his future were secure no matter what. Her second act was to bring the barn back to life. She didn't want to erase its history. She wanted to honor it. She hired a team of local builders, skilled artisans who understood old wood and stone. They spent the autumn and early winter transforming the leaning giant. They reinforced the ancient post and beam frame, replacing the rotten wood but leaving the great, scarred timbers exposed. They laid a new foundation, put on a new roof, and installed huge, insulated glass windows that flooded the interior with light. The vast, open space was partitioned into rooms, a warm, modern home rising from within the rustic skeleton of the past. The hollow beam in the attic, its treasure now gone, was left in place, a silent monument to the secret it had kept for so long. The sounds of construction, the whine of saws and the rhythmic tapping of hammers, were the sounds of a future being built. The smell of fresh sawdust and new paint replaced the old sense of decay and rust. Sarah was there every day, not just as a client, but as a partner in the resurrection, her hands learning the feel of new wood, her mind absorbing the language of blueprints and joists. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. One cold evening in late winter, they ate their first meal in their new home. The barn was transformed. A fire crackled and snapped in a large stone fireplace that now stood where the glittering mountain of gold had once been. The cavernous space was now a warm, inviting living area, with comfortable sofas, soft rugs, and shelves filled with books. The lantern had been replaced by warm, recessed lighting that made the old wooden beams glow. Sarah, Leo, and Buddy sat at a long, wooden dining table, a feast of roasted chicken and potatoes spread before them. The wind howled outside, rattling the new window panes, but inside, all was calm and safe. Leo, his face glowing in the firelight, looked around the room, his eyes wide with a quiet, happy wonder. "I love our new house, Mom," he said, his voice soft with contentment. Sarah looked at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Me too, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Me too." The ghosts were gone. The fear was gone. All that remained was a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being exactly where they were supposed to be. A few months later, on a warm evening in early summer, Sarah sat on the wide porch of her renovated home. The sun was setting over the river valley, the same sun that had once seemed to mock her with its dying light. Now its rays were a gentle golden caress, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and brilliant orange. The light was golden, just like the gold they had found, but this light was warm, alive, and free for everyone. Leo sat beside her, leaning against her side, reading a book. He was healthy and happy, his face full of the easy confidence of a child who knows he is safe and loved. At their feet, Buddy lay with his head on his paws, his tail giving a slow, contented thump against the wooden porch floor. His fur, the color of light brown sugar, shone in the evening light. He lifted his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the loyal guardian who had led them through the darkness and into this new life. Sarah looked out at the valley, at the river winding its way through the green fields. The barn, their home, no longer leaned. It stood strong and proud, a symbol not of ruin, but of resilience and rebirth. The dust of the past had settled, and the future stretched out before them, bright and full of promise. In that quiet, perfect moment, Sarah felt a wave of profound gratitude wash over her. She finally understood what true wealth was. It wasn't the cold, heavy weight of gold buried in the dark. It was the warmth of a child's head on her shoulder, the steadfast loyalty of a good dog, and the quiet, unshakable peace of a place to call home.